Okay, everything up above in concept 1 is review. Now in concept 2, we start getting into taking the square root of a negative number. The thing is, all your whole life, all of your math teachers have been telling you that you can't take the square root of a negative number. Well, actually you can. The answer, though, is an imaginary number. So let's talk about I a little bit. The square root of negative 1. Again, you've been told there is no such thing. There is. It's an imaginary number. The number is I. I write my i's kind of like that, where it's a cursive lowercase I. In a book, you will see it like an italic lowercase I. But when you see my little curvy like that, that means it's an I. If you just want to make yours a normal straight I, that's fine. But the square root of negative 1 is I. And so just like before, up above here, when I was breaking them down, and like with 75, I broke it down to 25 times 3, I'm going to do the same thing here. That is, I know that negative 25 is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. That equals negative 25. So I was just told a second ago that the square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 25, we know what that is 5. So the answer here is 5i. So when you take the square root of a perfect square, but it's negative, you just have to put an I with it. So I think you can guess what the answer is to number 2. The answer on number 2 is 12i, because the square root of 144 is 12, but it's negative, so we need an I. Now, when we simplify, we're going to do a similar pattern. That is, if it was just a 27, I did that a second ago up here. Okay, square root of 27 was 3 radical 3. However, this needs an I with it. So I'm going to say it's 3i radical 3. Notice there's no negative in my answers. There's no negative. It's imaginary, but it's not negative. Those are two different concepts. Another thing to notice is I like to keep the I in front of the radical sign, because sometimes if you put it behind the radical sign, it looks like it's inside the radical. And so to avoid that confusion, I always put mine on the outside in the front. Number 4, if you haven't taken a second to do number 4 yet, look at number 4 and see what that would come out to be. Okay, it's going to be 5i radical 2, because 50 breaks down to 25 times 2, and the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 2 is square root 2, but there was a negative in there, so I had to put an I on my answer. Number 5 is a perfect square. It's a fraction, and it has a negative. Take a second. What do you think on number 5? Okay, for number 5, 5 over 8 times I. Or you could have 5i over 8. Number 6, again, we have to simplify it. And so 8 is 4 times 2, so that's 2i radical 2. And the bottom is just a 3. You could write it 2 radical 2 over 3 with an I next to it. But I'm going to leave mine like this. Okay, we get to number 7 and we start to talk about rationalizing the denominator. Do you remember talking about rationalizing the denominator? And you probably talked about it in Algebra 1. You definitely talked about it in geometry. Well, on number 7, actually, the 2 cancels out. Do you see that? 2 goes into 98. So that actually can simplify down to negative 49. And so that's just a 7i. Number 8, though, we are going to have to rationalize the denominator. And so if you don't remember what that means is you cannot have a radical in the denominator. So I have a negative, so that's going to be an I. Square root of 25 is 5, so let me put 5i in the numerator. But in the denominator, radical 3 does not simplify, so I have to leave it as radical 3. But do you remember the rule that you cannot have a radical in the denominator? And so we have to multiply this by radical 3 and multiply this by radical 3. And so when that happens, do you remember what radical 3 times radical 3 is? It's radical 9, and radical 9 is just a positive 3. So our answer here is 5i radical 3 over 3. And that 3 and that radical 3 cannot cancel out. Okay, number 19, it cannot be simplified. But you cannot leave a negative underneath the radical. It's just one of those rules that we have, like all these other rules, that just you can't do it. That's not really standard form. So we have to take out the negative, and the square root of negative 1 is I. And so this is just I times radical 13. And that's all you can do. You can't do anything more than that. Okay, 52. You have to think about, does it break down? Is there a perfect square that goes in? And there actually is. So the negative gives us a negative 1. 52 breaks down to 4 times 13. And so that comes down to 2i radical 13. And the last one, number 11, it's a lot like number 9. You cannot simplify it. So it's just I radical 33, because 33 does not simplify. So that's the answer.